Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Liz Krueger. Welcome to my town hall on the SCRIE Senior Citizen Rent Increase Program, also known as the Rent Freeze Program. Before we get into the details with our guests, let me just remind everybody who's viewing this event on either Zoom or Facebook, or who's calling into this evening's program, that this is what we're going to be discussing tonight: how to limit our rent increases if we live in the right kind of housing. As always, we have closed captioning for this evening's event. As a viewer, you can activate your closed captioning to view the text on your device, which really helps even people who think that they're hearing pretty well, but it's amazing how text can help clarify things. So if you're on Zoom, click on the live transcript in the meeting controls to start viewing your closed captioning. And if you're on Facebook Live, you'll see a setting button in the bottom right-hand corner of the video. Click on the CC for closed caption to activate the process. As always, this forum is being recorded, and everyone who RSVP'd will receive an email with links to the event video and the resources that are posted in the chat within a few days. They will also receive our presenters' PowerPoints. So even though there's lots and lots of detailed information, don't feel that you have to write everything down for yourself, because you're going to have it available to you within a few days. Before we begin tonight's program, I want to talk to you about COVID. Yes, it's here. As you've heard, we're experiencing a new COVID wave, and even though this wave is not as severe as others in the past, it's causing a growing number of COVID infections, and hospitalizations are on the rise. To help avoid COVID, you may want to take precautionary measures such as wearing a mask in public, indoor locations, and around large groups of people. I was taking the bus yesterday and I saw a good number of people wearing their masks, and I have decided I will also be wearing my mask in public for now. The best way to protect yourself against COVID is to stay up to date with the COVID-19 vaccinations, and there are new approved ones that are becoming available. So the 23-24 updated Moderna and Pfizer COVID-19 vaccines have been approved for everyone 6 months old and above. For adults, at least 2 months must have passed since your last COVID-19 vaccination. And resources to help you find vaccine sites and how to make a vaccination appointment are being posted on the chat. Our office has been informed that insurance providers, including Original Medicare, Medicare Advantage, commercial health insurance providers, are working on updating their systems for billing purposes. It may take several days before this process has been complete, but nobody should have to actually pay for the COVID vaccine, and that they will get covered. Again, this COVID vaccine is not a booster from the vaccines you've had before. It's actually a new COVID vaccine to respond to this new version that is now traveling throughout the world. So again, even if you're thinking, I had the vaccine, I had the boosters, I haven't been sick or haven't been sick for quite a while with COVID, please go ahead and get this new COVID vaccine. Also, it's about time for everybody to start planning to get their flu vaccine for the season as well. And we have learned that you can have your flu vaccine and your COVID vaccine the same day at the same time. There's no concern about a conflict between the two vaccines. Okay, now to our roundtable. We're calling it Stay Put for the Long Term, the Senior Citizens Rent Increase Exemption Program, or SCRIE. So many of the calls we receive from constituents are about housing affordability. And if you live in a rent-regulated apartment and you're at least 62 years old, you might be eligible for SCRIE, which can help keep your home affordable. Because as the normal rent would go up, if you're participating in the SCRIE program, your landlord gets the increase vis-a-vis his property tax bill going down rather than your rent bill going up. So it's a win for you. There's no negative for landlords. Most landlords have no problem whatsoever participating in the SCRIE program. We have two extremely knowledgeable speakers this evening. First, we will hear from Kim Lerner, the director of the Benefits Outreach Program at LiveOn New York. And Kim will give a brief overview of LiveOn's benefit program and give you information about the SCRIE program. After Kim, we will hear from Ine Park, the ombudsperson at the Office of Taxpayer Advocate at the New York City Department of Finance, the city agency that administers the SCRIE program. Ine is she's experiencing Wi-Fi problems, so her camera might not be on during the event, but you'll be able to listen to her and follow along with her PowerPoint program. Many of you submitted questions about SCRIE ahead of time, and after the presentation, I'll be moderating a Q&A session with both experts. We received many questions about how to apply for SCRIE and what actually counts towards calculating income in the SCRIE program. I believe many of those questions will be answered by the two experts in their presentation, but I will try to make sure to get through as many of the questions as you asked that haven't already been answered by their presentations. And with that, I am pleased to introduce Kim Lerner. Good evening, Kim.
Good evening, Senator Krueger. Thank you so much. Good evening to everybody, and thank you so much for being here. Before I begin, of course, I want to thank Senator Krueger for this opportunity to talk about SCRIE and DRE with you all, and especially for being such a wonderful champion for older adults in New York City and also the rest of the state. And I also want to thank the Senator's outstanding staff, Wendy Brennan, Ian Stewart, Dana, and Audrey, for being so wonderful to work with and for organizing this event. As Senator Krueger said, my name is Kim Lerner, and I am the director of LiveOn New York's Benefits Outreach Program. And tonight I'm going to give you, as Senator Krueger said, an overview of the SCRIE program. We'll discuss what SCRIE is, the eligibility criteria, and how to apply for the benefits. And I'll also tell you how LiveOn New York's Benefits Outreach Program can help you throughout the process. So I'm going to share my screen so we can begin. Okay. So before I go into the meat of the discussion, I just want to tell you a little bit about LiveOn New York because many people may not be familiar with us. LiveOn New York is a nonprofit organization of approximately now 120 member agencies that provide programs and services to older New Yorkers. So that includes older adult centers, NORCs, case management agencies, home delivered meal programs, all of the programs and services that are available to older New Yorkers throughout their lives as they get older. And LiveOn New York's mission is to make New York City a better place to age. And we do that by focusing on three main areas. The first is we work on the city and state level to advocate for just policies on behalf of our members and older adults throughout the city. Second is we provide training and continuing ed courses to social workers, caseworkers, and other staff members who work directly with older adults. And third is our direct service program, which is our benefits outreach program. Our benefits outreach program helps older adults and others, we do not turn anybody away, by screening people through for all the benefits they may be eligible for. And then we assist them throughout the application process. And I'll go into more detail about that at the end of the presentation. So let's go into SCRIE and DRE. So I'm talking about DRE as well, just in case there are people who may be eligible for that benefit joining us as well. So SCRIE and DRE are also known as New York City's rent freeze program. SCRIE, as Senator Krueger said, is the Senior Citizen Rent Increase Exemption. DRE is the same program, but for people who are receiving disability benefits. So DRE stands for the Disability Rent Increase Exemption. And SCRIE and DRE, what SCRIE and DRE do, it will freeze the rent in certain types of rent regulated apartments and co-ops. As Senator Krueger said, she mentioned landlords and how landlords may be affected by you receiving SCRIE or DRE. And that's something that we really try to emphasize to people when they come to us, because oftentimes people are concerned about applying for SCRIE or DRE. They're concerned that their landlords will lose money. They're concerned that their landlords will get upset if they receive the benefit. And as Senator Krueger said, landlords do not lose money if you are receiving these benefits. They receive a property tax abatement. So in the amount that between the frozen rent and the increased rent. So that's really important. And also by law, landlords must accept SCRIE and DRE. Let's start with the eligibility for SCRIE and DRE. Eligibility is based on 4 components. First is the status of the tenant, and by status, I mean their age or their disability, depending on the benefit that they're applying for. Second is the type of apartment. So there are certain apartments that are eligible for SCRIE or DRE and some that are not. The third is income, and just stress it's based on income and not resources, so it doesn't matter how much money you have in the bank or any of your assets. And finally, the amount of the income that you pay towards the rent. So I'm going to go through each of them. As far as status, if you are applying for SCRIE, the tenant on the lease must be at least 62 years old. If the applicant is applying for DRE, the tenant on the lease must be receiving disability benefits. And when we're talking about disability benefits, we mean Social Security disability, U.S. Veterans disability, or compensation, and also disability-related Medicaid. Secondly, is of course the type of apartment that you live in. So to be eligible for SCRIE, you must live in a rent-stabilized, rent-controlled, Mitchell-Lama and some CF's apartments, SROs, and some hotels. So those are the types of apartments that are eligible for SCRIE. If you're living in a market rate apartment, unfortunately, you're not eligible for SCRIE. As far as household income, unlike many other benefits, SCRIE and DRE is based on the previous year's income. So when you apply for SCRIE, you must show proof of last year's income, and the total household income must have been $50,000 or less in the previous year. And by household, we mean everybody in the household except for roommates or boarders. And finally, the amount of income that you pay towards the rent. To be eligible for SCRIE or DRE, you must show that you're paying at least 1/3 of your income towards the rent. So for an example, if your monthly household income is $1,500, your rent must be at least $500 a month, 1/3 of $1,500, to be eligible for SCRIE or DRE. Where and how you apply for SCRIE or DRE really is determined by the type of apartment you live in. So if you are living in a rent-stabilized, rent-controlled SRO or hotel apartment, you would apply for SCRIE through the Department of Finance, also known as DOF. If you would live in a Mitchell-Lama or other type of regulated co-op, you would apply for SCRIE through the Department of Housing, Preservation and Development, also known as HPD. So that is for SCRIE. If you are in either types of apartments and you're applying for DRE, you would apply for DRE through the Department of Finance. You would not apply for it through HPD if you live in a Mitchell-Lama. All SCRIE applications go to DOF. In addition to the applications, you need to provide supporting documentation. And I'll go through the different types of supporting documentation depending on the type of building that or apartment that you live in. The first is the required documentation for rent stabilized apartments. You need to provide your ID with your date of birth. If you are applying for SCRIE, you do need to provide proof of your disability benefits. If you live in the rent stabilized apartment, you need to provide your current lease and your previous lease, and they both need to be signed by both you and your landlord. And again, you need to provide proof of the previous year's income. So that includes your tax return, your end of year statements like your 1099, your W-2s if you worked last year, or your end of year earnings if you have an IRA. If you are living in a rent-controlled apartment, usually people who live in, tenants who live in rent-controlled apartments do not get a lease. Well, they get a lease when they move in, but they don't get subsequent leases usually. So the landlord is supposed to provide each year what's called a maximum collectible rent form. And to apply for SCRIE, you need to provide entry. You need to provide the current maximum collectible rent form and last year's form. And of course, you also need to provide previous year's income, including your tax return and end of year statements. If you are living in a Mitchell-Lama or an HDFC co-op, you would again have to provide a copy of your ID with your date of birth, your previous year's income, and that includes again the tax return, end of year statements. If you do not file tax returns, and this is true for actually if you're applying through the Department of Finance as well, you do need to provide proof that you do not have to file taxes. So you can get that form through the IRS website. It's a non-filing letter just to prove that you didn't file taxes last year. And also if you are living in these types of co-ops, you need to provide your current Social Security award letter if you are receiving Social Security. So not only do you need to provide the previous year's income, you need to provide your current Social Security benefit letter. Now I wanted to go over some of the countable income that you need to include when you're applying for SCRIE or DRE. Social Security benefits, pensions, wages if you're working, unemployment, workers' comp or disability benefits, IRA and annuity earnings, not withdrawals, capital gains, interest and dividends, any support from family or friends that's consistent. And if you have a boarder or a roommate and they're providing you with income, you would need to provide proof of that as well. There is income that is excluded from being counted, and that includes cash gifts, inheritance, damages awarded if you have a personal injury lawsuit, income tax refunds, IRA and annuity distributions, SNAP, and if you're receiving energy assistance payments, including KEEP. So those benefits are not included as income. You are able to deduct your taxes from your income. So that includes federal, state, city, and Social Security taxes can be deducted. And really what happens is the Department of Finance or HPD will do that for you, so you don't have to calculate it. But those are the only deductions at the moment that are allowable. On the horizon are other allowances, including specifically medical expenses, but that has not been implemented yet, but hopefully it will be soon. Once you have SCRIE, you do need to maintain SCRIE entry by submitting a renewal form. And this is different for each for each type of building. If you are living in a rent stabilized and rent controlled building, you must submit a renewal every 1 or 2 years, depending on your lease or your agreement. You will receive notification in the mail from DOF every time you need to renew your benefit. If you live in a Mitchell-Lama or an HDFC, HPD requires that you renew every other year. And they will also send you a notification as well as a form to complete. So I did include some links to the applications if you're applying for SCRIE through the Department of Finance. There's a couple of ways you can apply or submit applications. You can submit applications through the DOF portal, known as TAP. You can submit the application via mail and also in person. So those are the 3 ways that you can submit the application. And again, the slides will be shared, so you will have these links. If you live in a Mitchell-Lama and you're applying through HPD, you would need to either submit the application via mail, or you can also submit it via email, and I have the information there. Unfortunately, at the moment, you can't apply online, but that may be in the offing at some point. So finally, how can LiveOn New York's benefits outreach help you? We, when somebody comes to us and calls us or emails us, what we do is we like to screen everybody for all the benefits they may be eligible for, because it's very possible you may not be familiar with all the benefits that are available to you. So it's always good to be screened. So we will screen you for all of those benefits, explain what each benefit does, whether you're potentially eligible or not, and tell you about the application process. Once you decide to apply, we can assist you in compiling all of the supporting documentation that you may need to provide. Oftentimes, you may not have the documentation, so we can help you access that. We'll assist you in completing the application, either over the phone or via mail or in person. We'll submit the application on your behalf to the administering agency. And very crucially, we will provide support throughout the process. And this is really crucial because oftentimes things arise, issues arise, and we hope that we're able to intervene on your behalf if they do come up, and so we can help you resolve the issue and so you can access the benefit. So you can reach LiveOn New York at 212-398-5045, or you can email us at benefits@liveon-ny.org, and you are most welcome to call me directly or email me directly. Again, my name is Kim Lerner. My email is KLERNER@liveon-ny.org, or you can give me a call at 212-398-6565, extension 228. And I included the link to our website in case you want more information. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Kim. That was great. And I just want to emphasize the value of having LiveOn do a benefits screening for you, because Kim gave one example in her presentation. She talked about the SNAP program not impacting your eligibility for SCRIE. Most people, if they're actually having trouble being able to pay their rent, probably also have a cash problem for other basic needs. For example, food. And the SNAP program is a program many, particularly older and disabled people, don't realize they're eligible for. It's 100% federal money that goes directly to you through a debit card to shop in whatever food store you already are shopping in. That money then creates jobs in your local economy, creates jobs throughout the entire food system. It's really a win-win for everybody, and there are not enough people who realize that this is a benefit that can help them. And if you can get, say, as a single older person $100 or $120 a month in SNAP, that will go a long way to helping you meet your basic needs, along with hopefully SCRIE, as we're discussing tonight. So thank you so much, Kim. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ine Park, the Ombudsperson, Office of the Taxpayer Advocate, New York City Department of Finance. Good evening. Are you there, Ine? I'm trying to hear you.
Good evening. Can you hear me now?
Yes, if you can just speak up as loud as you can, because I know you're having a few
I'll
problems.
try. Okay.
That's better.
As mentioned, my name is Ine Park. I'm the SCRIE Ombudsperson in the city's Office of the Taxpayer Advocate. And you may ask, what is a SCRIE Ombudsperson? And I will answer that question and a few others that our office gets, including what is the role of an ombudsperson, how you can calculate your frozen rent and the 1/3 monthly income rule, what you can do if you are denied or revoked, how you can continue the benefit of a prior household member if another tenant leaves, what happens to your SCRIE benefit if you move, and finally, how you might be able to adjust your frozen rent after a permanent income loss. So, as I mentioned, I'm one of the ombudspersons in the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate, which is an independent office in the city's Department of Finance. We're separate from the SCRIE unit, and we're separate from the rest of the divisions that operate the programs. So our office can assist you when you've tried to get a resolution from the SCRIE unit, but you just haven't been successful for whatever reason. Some of the examples would be if your application is denied, your benefit was revoked, or your appeal was rejected, or you just feel like you're not getting all the information you need from the Department of Finance. And so when these issues arise, we can advocate for you since we're not part of the SCRIE unit, so there's not that conflict of interest. And finally, we also want to hear from you regarding the larger issues that might affect the program as a whole. Well, we're required by law to publish an annual report to be delivered to the City Council each year that discusses all of these larger issues and makes recommendations. So it's very important that we hear from the tenants who participate. So let's start with the questions. Frozen rent. We're often asked how SCRIE decides what your frozen rent will be. As it says on the slide, for most tenants, their frozen rent is set at the rent in their prior lease. So to understand what that means, the first thing to keep in mind is that the idea behind SCRIE is not to lower the rent that you currently pay, but to prevent you from having to pay rent increases. If you think of it that way, you can understand why SCRIE asks for both your prior lease and your current lease when you first apply. So if you're approved for SCRIE, your rent could be frozen at that prior rent, and you would keep paying that amount without any increases. In fact, for most applicants who are approved, that is what happens. So here's how you can easily identify what your prior lease rent is. So first, you need to confirm when your current renewal lease started. So let's say you're submitting an initial application this month, September 2023. So you'd want to check when the lease that's in effect right now started. So for the sake of this example, let's say your lease started on July 1st of this year. So that's your current lease. So that you then need to identify the lease that came just before this one. So that would be the lease that ended on June 30th, 2023. So the rent that you were paying while on that lease is your prior lease rent, and that's where your rent will most likely be frozen. So now that you understand how prior lease rent works, I should let you know that there is an exception where your frozen rent isn't based on your prior lease rent. It doesn't happen very often, but sometimes your rent is frozen at an amount that's different from the prior lease rent. So why would this happen? Well, there's something called the 1/3 monthly income rule. So this should sound familiar to you. Kim mentioned it, that you have to have a rent that's higher than 1/3 of your monthly income to be eligible for SCRIE. But in addition to that, your frozen rent always has to be at least equal to or greater than 1/3 of your monthly income. It cannot be less. That means that when you submit your initial application, and assuming you qualify for the program, if 1/3 of your monthly income is higher than your prior lease rent, your frozen rent will be set at that higher 1/3 monthly income number, and it will stay at that number even if your income goes down by the time you renew. So every time you renew, also, SCRIE will look at what your current frozen rent is and compare it to 1/3 of your monthly income, whatever you've reported with that renewal. And if 1/3 of your monthly income is higher, your frozen rent will go up to equal that amount. So in case you want a shortcut to figuring out what your 1/3 monthly income amount is, you take your total annual household income and divide it by 36. So that's the 1/3 monthly income rule. There's one other aspect of frozen rent that comes up often, and that's the issue of what's called MCIs. MCI stands for Major Capital Improvement, and these are building-wide improvements that are essential to the building infrastructure. So when a landlord performs an MCI, they can submit an application to the New York State Division of Housing and Community Renewal, also known as DHCR, to raise your rent based on the MCI work. If the application is approved, DHCR will issue an order that grants the rent increase, and that would be reflected in the lease rent. But if you're already on SCRIE, or if you submit an initial application to SCRIE and you're approved, and that's within 90 days of that DHCR order, then SCRIE should cover that increase so that it's not added to your frozen rent. But in order for them to do that, SCRIE has to get a copy of that MCI order so that they can calculate it into the landlord's credit. And what you see there is what the top of that order would look like. And there's actually a one-page form called an adjustment application that you should submit together with the MCI order to help it get processed more efficiently. It's on the Rent Free's website, and there are two versions. There's a landlord version and a tenant version, but it doesn't matter who submits the MCI as long as someone gets it to SCRIE. But just keep in mind that if it's an MCI that was issued more than 90 days before you first applied for SCRIE, SCRIE will not cover it. You will most likely be paying for that MCI as part of your frozen rent obligation. So moving on from frozen rent, question of what to do if my initial application is denied or my renewal application is denied, in which case my benefit is revoked. So if the reason that you're denied is because you're ineligible, you can always submit an appeal. There's a form for appealing also online on the Rent Free site. It has to be submitted within 120 days of that letter of decision that you received. And you can always request more information about why you were denied. The letter will give you a reason, but sometimes it's hard to understand what that really means. You can always call SCRIE and ask someone to explain to you why you were denied. But if that appeal is denied, the Department of Finance rule is that you can't have a second appeal. So you then technically have to take the matter to court and file for what's called an Article 78 hearing. But if you still think that the denial was clearly wrong, you can contact our office and you can discuss with us whether you might have a basis for us to request a reconsideration by SCRIE. And they'll often reconsider if it's clear that there was just a miscommunication, or if it's really that the tenant needed help preparing the appeal, and that's really why the appeal ended up being denied. And the other thing that people sometimes forget is that you can always reapply. So if you're denied, it doesn't mean you can't apply again. And if it's your renewal that was denied specifically because you were not within the income limits, you can apply again as soon as you have the next year's income documents. And if you're approved, you can get back to your old frozen rent. So normally when you have to submit a new initial application, you have to start over. But in this particular circumstance, you don't have to reset your frozen rent. You will get back the frozen rent that you were paying before you were revoked. Now, you won't get SCRIE for the months in between, but once you are reapproved, you'll get to restart at your old frozen rent. And that's really crucial for a lot of people who've been on the program for a long time, because when they're revoked, normally they would have to start over. Their frozen rent would be much higher. But the income spike policy allows you to regain your old frozen rent. Now, let's say you're denied because you missed a deadline. You are past, for example, the 6 months that you get to renew your application. First of all, we tell people, check to see if you have a record of when you submitted it. If you can prove that you actually did submit your documents before the deadline, sometimes SCRIE will accept that and reinstate you. And this is why we always recommend sending documents using a method that provides a tracking number. Of course, you can reply, but the income spike policy won't apply if you were just late, and your frozen rent will be reset. Now, if you can show there were extraordinary circumstances that made it too difficult for you to submit your documents in time, you might want to request an extension of time for good cause. That's basically just writing to SCRIE with your explanation. And if they accept it, they'll grant you another 6 months to complete your application. But it usually has to be something really unusual, something that really made it so difficult for you to get your documents in. If the reason that you needed more time is a medical reason, if it's due to a disability or a physical or mental impairment, you can apply to the Department of Finance's Equal Employment Opportunity Office to get an extension. And there's a lot more flexibility with an EEO extension, but it just might take longer for you to get that extension. And then just keep in mind, then you have to submit all the renewal documents that you were supposed to submit originally, and you will have to be approved just as you would for any other renewal application. So another question we get a lot is about what happens if the SCRIE tenant moves out or dies, and a remaining household member wants to continue the benefit. In this case, you would have what's called a benefit takeover. So the remaining household member continues the benefit, and it's at the same frozen rent. They don't have to start over. But to take over an existing benefit, there are requirements that must be met. So first, the new applicant has to be eligible for SCRIE or DRE themselves. It doesn't matter what the previous tenant had. If it was SCRIE, the new tenant can have DRE and vice versa. But it has to be the case that when the prior tenant leaves or passes away, the new applicant has to be eligible for one of the programs themselves. The person taking over the benefit has to submit a benefit takeover application. Again, it's on the website with all the other forms. Except if they're the spouse, they don't have to submit a benefit takeover application. They technically just need to renew the benefit on time. Now, there is a time limit. You're supposed to submit the benefit takeover application within 6 months of the tenant leaving the apartment or passing away. Or if SCRIE sends you a letter saying this benefit is revoked because the tenant is no longer there, from 90 days after that letter, you need to submit the benefit takeover application. Again, this is the rule. If you do find yourself beyond those deadlines, we would suggest that you still go ahead and submit the application, because we have known SCRIE to be flexible in some of these cases. And you also need to show that the tenant has died or permanently moved with some sort of documentation. And finally, you'll need to prove that you have succession rights, either by showing that you've been added as a tenant on the lease, or you can just get it in writing from your landlord that they agree that you can take over the lease. Finally, I just wanted to note that it used to be that if the prior tenant didn't name you as a household member on prior applications, you were not eligible to take over the benefit. But I'm glad to say that this has now changed. You are still eligible to take over the benefit, even if you weren't previously named, but you will have to show that your income wouldn't have put the household over the eligibility limits during those past benefit periods. This is actually a great example of those larger issues that I mentioned that our office takes on, and how what we hear from tenants can actually lead to a change. I'll talk briefly now about what happens to a SCRIE benefit when a tenant who has SCRIE moves to another apartment. First, just a reminder that the same eligibility requirements will apply. Your new apartment has to be rent regulated if you want to continue with SCRIE. And in order to do so, you would submit what's called an apartment transfer application. If you do move, many tenants assume that their frozen rent will stay the same, but this is usually not the case. In fact, if the new rent is higher, the frozen rent will almost always be higher as well. So if you want to try and estimate how your frozen rent would change if you move, you take your current benefit amount and you subtract it from the rent in the new apartment. So here's an example. In your current apartment, say you haven't moved yet, your lease rent is $1,200. Your frozen rent is $1,000. So the landlord gets the difference, $200. If you move to a new apartment that's $1,500, that's the leased rent, then your new frozen rent is going to be the new lease rent of $1,500 minus the existing credit of $200. So now your new frozen rent is going to be $1,300. So your frozen rent has gone up by $300. So keep in mind, if you move, you usually don't just take your SCRIE benefit with you exactly the same form. If your new rent is higher, your frozen rent will probably be higher as well. Finally, I'll touch briefly on redeterminations, which are a way to lower your frozen rent under very specific circumstances. So to lower your frozen rent based on a redetermination, which is a kind of application that you can submit, you have to have been receiving the benefit for at least 12 months when you apply. And you must submit a redetermination application, also on the website, within 6 months of the event that caused your income loss. And that loss has to be at least 20% of a loss since your last application. And you have to prove that the loss is permanent. So the most common situation where a redetermination is approved is when a household member who had income passes away. But sometimes a household member who's an income earning household member moves out. And if that's the case, you have to provide some sort of documentation like the person's new lease at their new place or some other clear evidence that they've moved in order to be approved for a redetermination. I'll just note also, if you're submitting a redetermination and you're trying to take over the benefit at the same time, so this would be a situation where a household member has passed away, obviously an income loss, you're the person who's trying to take the benefit over, and you also would like the frozen rent to be lowered, you should submit those two applications together. In fact, there's a space on the benefit takeover application where you can indicate that you're submitting a redetermination as well. So if you're approved for redetermination, your frozen rent should be reduced proportionately to the amount of income loss, but the 1/3 rule still applies. So your reduced frozen rent will not be less than 1/3 of your monthly income. So those are the topics that I wanted to cover today. And if you take nothing else away from this glut of information, I hope you'll keep in mind that the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate and my colleagues there are there to help through those situations where you might need some extra assistance beyond the normal channels just to stay on SCRIE or to get into the program. With that, thank you all so much for your time. Thank you, Kim, as always, for your presentation and all the amazing work you do. And thank you, Senator Krueger, and your outstanding staff for giving us the opportunity to be part of this evening.
Well, thank you so much. And see, nobody ever thinks the tax people are helpful, and usually they get worried about them. But in fact, this is such a valuable program, and I'm really delighted that the city has their office with their own advocate to participate. I'm going to ask both of you to come back on screen, but I guess maybe only one of you are the visual that's working. Thanks. I don't know whether Ms. Park can get her visual working right now, because we're going to go into the Q&A section. And just a reminder, we'll be sending you a follow-up email with the links to the videos and all the resources that our presenters were referencing, as well as their PowerPoints, so that you don't feel like you have to be writing down everything. I do want to point out that when the taxpayer advocate was talking about the process of appealing if you get rejected, I just want to emphasize it's the policy of my office to tell people to always appeal if they think that they've been wrongly rejected for any benefit. Sorry, but government makes mistakes sometimes, and it's absolutely possible that you may have just not filled out something correctly the first time round, or you need to follow up with someone to get clarification so that you can get the correct information put into your application. And the truth is, with most government benefits, when you're rejected, appeals usually go your way statistically. So don't give up if in fact you're rejected. You might not be eligible, but don't give up after the first try. So there are, again, many questions. We'll see how many we might be able to get to. And some of them are technical because they're people who've actually tried to get through the SCRIE process. So the annual income is based on the total income from line 9 of your 1040 tax form, or the taxable income after deductions, line 15 of your 1040 form. Who knows that one?
So I will answer, and Innie, please correct me if I am wrong, because I may be, but I think I'm right on this one thing. It is you would report the number on line 9, and then in the application, you'll see, at least on the DOF applications, you'll see that there's a space where you can put in your how much you've paid in taxes, which is listed in on your tax return. And then DOF will do the calculations to determine what your income was.
Great.
Yeah. I would just add to that really it's a little bit more complicated, just because SCRIE has its own special way of calculating income. So I think that that's right, but there may be other things in your tax forms that SCRIE will count that you wouldn't expect. I find that to get as close as possible to what SCRIE is going to come up with, just include all income, just as Kim explained, except for those exclusions, and then deduct your federal, state, and local income taxes and your Social Security taxes. But everything else, assume that SCRIE will include it, including, for example, only part of your Social Security is taxable, sometimes none of it. But SCRIE counts all of it, including the Medicare deduction. So people don't expect that. And on the flip side, if you think that you might be over, still apply. You just don't know how any individual processor is going to put in the numbers. But it's kind of hard to say in advance how they're going to calculate. It's really sort of all of your income minus your income taxes. And so it's complicated. But the bottom line is apply.
Thank you. So I know this is a very common concern and question. So every year, or usually every year, Social Security has a COLA, cost of living adjustment, which increases people's Social Security by some amount. What happens if you're on SCRIE, but your COLA increase will increase your income above the $50,000? I see two different questions with similar examples. One is an expectation that the COLA will probably increase their income to 51,000. Another person saying the COLA might put them over by 2,000. Is there anything we can all do about that at this time?
There is actually a very specific answer to this. And I think it's a great example of how SCRIE is this brilliant, very simple idea, but the rules governing SCRIE can be complicated. So the answer is, in the years when the cost of living adjustment is less than the consumer price index increase for that year, so that would include 2022, the cost of living adjustment is deducted. So for people who had the huge cost of living adjustment in 2022 in their Social Security, if a processor is processing your paperwork correctly, they should deduct, I think, that 5.9% cost of living adjustment. So you shouldn't have to worry about it for that year. But in a year where that adjustment is less than if the consumer price index is covered essentially by the cost of living adjustment, then it's not deducted. But for 2022, you should be okay.
And then Kim had referenced earlier that there's hopefully going to be some expanded eligibility for SCRIE. We passed it at the state level, and now we need the city council to pass a parallel bill to implement the expanded eligibility. And I know that one of my council members, Keith Powers, has said he's going to try to introduce and get that bill passed as quickly as possible, which will then allow us to talk to you about expanded eligibility and expanded deductibility once the city council and the mayor hopefully come to agreement and move the bill at the local level. So I won't go into more details now because it's not real and I don't want to confuse people, but hopefully that will be happening sooner than later. Okay, so how is your annual income determined? Well, as we already heard, there's a bunch of different categories, but is my investment income included? How about required mandatory distributions, which are required under a number of different pension models for people who are retired? Are investment income and mandatory required distributions counted towards your income? We stopped the guests.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in and into the deep end. The mandatory distribution is not included, is not counted. What is counted are the earnings on it. Now, I know that's very confusing, and it's confusing to me too, but that is what I have learned from experts. Does that sound right?
I think that's probably as much information as you can give. That's as clear as it gets. I think that's right. Investment income, if you're talking about just straight up capital gains, yes, all of that is included.
And then there was a follow-up question. Does your RMD count if it's a qualified charitable deduction? Since we just heard that RMD doesn't count, I guess if it's a charitable deduction, it also wouldn't count. Is that reasonable?
Reasonable.
Okay. So let's assume that for now. All right. Are there limits to how, I'm sorry. I didn't want to cut you off, Ms. Parker.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay. Are there limits to how much money you can have in bank accounts, Roth IRAs, pension funds, retirement accounts?
No. Assets, sitting assets are not considered income, and there are no limits on how much you can have in that type of in those types of assets.
Does rent from a roommate need to be declared as part of your $50,000 a year maximum income?
If that income or payment is made to you personally, yes, it does need to be reported as rental income.
But if they're paying it directly to the landlord as part of the rent, then it does not?
I believe that is the case. Ini, is that correct?
SCRIE might actually interpret that as kind of indirect income to you because it lowers the amount of rent that you pay. It's one of those questions where there's not a clear answer. I would say it's possible that they will still consider it income.
Okay. And remember, if you have a landlord in a rent regulated unit, you have to be careful that the amount of rent you're collecting from your subtenant is not more than their share of the apartment that they're using. So that's another question in the housing side of it. It's not really applicable for the SCRIE side of it, but fairly important if you are living in rent regulated housing and charging somebody to live in your home. Okay, what if the building has an agreement with Spectrum? I guess that's the cable people, cable and internet, and I must pay the fixed amount. Can I include this as part of my rent when determining the 1/3 of monthly rent rule? Oh, so the building basically has the deal. It may even show up as a part of your rent bill, that there's an X amount cost to Spectrum. That's an interesting question.
I think usually those kinds of additional costs, SCRIE is not going to cover those. for example, they won't cover individual apartment improvements. It's only the larger building improvements, the MCIs that are approved by the state, essentially, that they will include, or certain other, sometimes there are fees associated with living in a 421A building. SCRIE will cover those, but usually these kinds of extras, SCRIE will not cover.
But is it an extra if you have no choice but to have to pay it because it's basically included as a part of your rent for a specific activity, even so you don't get a choice about it?
It's a good question. I mean, I think SCRIE would take a look at whether the agreement to pay that extra is really part of your lease, or if it's more of a side agreement that you have with your landlord. I'm not sure, but in the past, what I've seen happen is that SCRIE will exclude these kinds of additional rents that are not really part of the base rent.
All right, so I'll suggest to the person, go ahead and apply.
Yes.
Let's see what happens for you. Let's think about the appeal argument. If you can really show that there's no way for you to avoid having to pay that money under the building's rules or the rent or the lease language. Oh, what about a lease? What if I'm living in a rent regulated apartment for many years. I don't have a lease, which is not required under rent regulation. But it might be required under SCRIE. Can I use an annual apartment registration document instead? The document clearly shows that the apartment is rent regulated and shows the exact rent amount. This is definitely a real life thing out there for people.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say that I've never seen SCRIE approve an initial application that doesn't have at least a current lease. I think on occasion, if there's enough evidence of the past rent amount and there's a current lease sometimes, but really I've never seen them go ahead and approve an initial application at least. Once you have an initial approved, then there are other things that you can submit, but it's very hard to start SCRIE without having a lease if you're rent stabilized. So Kim, have you seen anything otherwise?
No, I haven't.
Yeah.
Damn. All right, so then you need an attorney to help you get a copy of a lease.
I mean, again, unless they're living in a rent control apartment and they have a maximum allowable rent form. But other than that, no.
Okay. And so I think we went over the MCI charge issue. So I don't think we need to go through those questions. Oh, this is real basic. Did anybody explain how we get a SCRIE application? I think we did. I think you did, Kim, in your materials, right?
Yes, there are links.
Okay, great. And again, on those resource lists that we're going to be sending you all, there was information about that and how to contact SCRIE and how to contact the ombudsperson. So that's all good. Oh, I know it's varied over the years, but how long does it usually take to hear back once you've made the SCRIE application?
It has varied quite a bit over the years. Right now, it's really taking several weeks. It's quite unusual for the processing time to be so long. But there are a number of reasons why the number of applications has increased quite a bit. And from my perspective, unfortunately, the number of processors hasn't risen as quickly. So right now, I think if you submitted an initial application, you are looking at least, I would say, 3 weeks, 4 weeks before you hear back. That could change very quickly. If the number of applications coming in changes. Usually it's more like 2 weeks, but right now I think it's probably about twice that long for an initial.
So here's a place where I think it's important to just highlight, even if it's taking a while to get the response, even if you've had to apply for an appeal, so it takes you longer to finally get a yes, under the law, you're eligible for SCRIE back to the date you applied. So even if you're thinking, oh no, my lease amount changes October 1st, I still haven't heard yet what's going to happen. again, if you're assuming you're approved, you will be eligible retroactive to the date of the application. So now, what do I do if I haven't heard back? Am I supposed to pay the new rent amount? Or am I going to get that back somehow afterwards if I've overpaid a couple of months of rent?
We recommend, if it's your if initial application, we recommend that you do pay the new amount, because you don't want to be, if let's say you're not eligible, you're going to have to pay that money back to the landlord. So it probably is safest, play it safe and pay the increase if you can.
Okay.
This is another reason why it's a very good idea to send your application with a certificate of mailing or with a tracking number, because if you send an application to SCRIE and they somehow say, well, we didn't get it, you have to reapply, and several months have gone by, you want to be able to prove to them that you actually did submit an application months ago, and that's when your benefits should have started, even if you're approved 6 months later. It's another reason. I know it's sometimes costly to do that, but we do recommend that you try and get something that proves when your application got into SCRIE's hands.
Okay. And then once I've been approved for SCRIE, do I have to reapply at every lease renewal? Will the Department of Finance let me know when I have to reapply or renew SCRIE? How does that time frame work?
So about a month before you are up for your new lease, SCRIE sends everyone who needs to renew a renewal lease. A renewal application. Sorry. But if for whatever reason you don't receive it, go online, call 311. There are many ways to get your renewal application. That's how they remind you. And sometimes people just don't get that piece of mail and then they don't renew. But it's up to the applicant to remember to renew. And if they don't get an application in the mail, they should, figure out some other way to get it. Lots of organizations have copies of them. You can get one online. You can call 311. You can go to the walk-in center and get one. And also keep in mind, you have 6 months to complete that renewal. So that means that you also have all that time to get your application, fill it out. And during that time, you can continue paying your frozen rent. But yes, with every renewal lease, you have to submit a renewal application.
So I'm on SCRIE and it's not up for renewal yet, but my income has gone up or down. What am I supposed to do? Do I have to talk to someone at the Department of Finance, or do I just wait for the next time it's time to re-up?
It's really only when you are submitting an application that your income becomes relevant. You don't have to keep Department of Finance apprised of your financial situation.
So I'm in the middle of a 2-year lease period and my income goes down. So I think now I will be eligible for SCRIE. Am I allowed to apply in the middle of a lease period?
You can apply anytime.
Great. I thought that was the answer. I wanted to make sure to get that question in. Oh, we have so many questions here tonight. What happens if I sublet my apartment? Can I still apply and qualify for SCRIE? Or must the, primary renter apply?
The person who needs to apply it must be on the lease, the primary leaseholder.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think I actually asked that question backwards, although it's still a relevant question. So this was the person, they're subletting their apartment to someone else. So then can I qualify for SCRIE, or do I? So clearly the subletter can't apply because they're not in the lease. But if I'm subletting, can I still apply for SCRIE?
I don't think that there's I don't know of a restriction on applying because you have a subletter.
Okay. I know the answer, but I'm going to ask the question because it's so important. If I successfully participate in SCRIE, will the stability of retaining my home be compromised? Will this somehow challenge my right to remain a rent-regulated tenant? And the answer is it will absolutely not compromise you or your rights under your lease. And again, the vast majority of landlords are familiar with and very comfortable with the SCRIE or DRE program, because the truth is, especially if they know that, you know, you've been someone who's been having some struggle paying their rent, especially as it goes up every year or every other year, they're quite confident that the city of New York is going to stick around and still be providing property tax abatements. So it's almost like the SCRIE DRE program are guaranteeing them that share of the rent, because it just gets taken care of. So, but no, this should not be a reason at all that you don't apply for these benefits. It's not going to put your tenancy under rent regulation law at risk at all. Okay, Mitchell-Lama rentals and co-ops and SCRIE. I was told by my building the SCRIE form is different from Mitchell-Lama buildings. How can I make sure I have the correct form?
The Mitchell-Lama application is one page, whereas the applications, if you're living at another type of apartment, it's several pages. And it will say HPD on the application, so you probably will not make a mistake.
So my son is on my Mitchell-Lama co-op lease with me, but he doesn't live there anymore. Does his income need to be included and therefore disqualify me from SCRIE?
This is the question I was mulling over in my head when I saw it. I really don't know the exact answer to it. I can give you a supposition, but I really think that it's probably best to go straight to HPD to get that answer.
Okay. Because it may be that it's a challenge to your co-op status, that he's considered a co-op owner with you, but he's not living there, versus with under the SCRIE rules. I don't know either, but so I think you're right. Try and see what happens first. What's the best way for a Mitchell-Lama shareholder to reach HPD SCRIE unit for applications and assistance? Oh, that was listed on one of your slides, Kim. So when you get the materials after tonight, you'll see the section. There was a slide specifically on the HPD SCRIE unit. Okay, good. Okay. Can the SCRIE limit be increased? If and when the state and city come to agreement with both a local law and a state law, yes, it can be increased. And it's always the dance between the needs of people for this program and how much of the property taxes the city prepared to give up to have this program reach more people. I don't know, Kim, do you have a different answer there?
Good answer.
Okay, I figure since I'm a legislator and we legislate this, I could take a stab at that. All right, new question. I was laid off a month ago. My income this year and especially next year will be much lower than the last year. How do I address this situation when last year's tax return won't reflect my current income?
I'm going to leave that for Amy if she can respond.
If this is a new application and your income for last year includes wages that you don't have anymore, if you've retired, if you're done working, there is a rule that allows SCRIE to exclude your wage income from the prior year. But short of that, SCRIE isn't going to change the way they calculate your income based on the fact that you will have less income this year. You probably will just need to apply as soon as you have the following year's income, with the exception being, like I said, if you've retired, then I think there's actually a place on the application where you can check off that you've retired, and then they'll exclude your wage income and project a year of income without those.
Thank you. All right, let's see, we still have a little time. I'm going to move to some questions that came in during the presentation. Let's see, I'm extremely lucky to have low-income affordable housing through the 80/20 program. I have a rent-stabilized lease. However, I am required to submit all my financial records annually. The stated reason is to see if my financials meet the low income criteria. I do not understand how to determine the number that would change my status. What would happen if I did not meet the low income criteria? Would I go to the middle income status? Would I lose my rent stabilized lease? So it's not really a question about SCRIE. It's more about if you're going through to collect all your financial information in order to try to get eligibility for SCRIE, and then you discover that that actually kicks you into a different category for income, would it affect your 80-20 rent regulated apartment? So I'm going to look at Kim, because I'm not sure it's a SCRIE question specifically. It's really the relationship between two different eligibility benefits. And I confess, I don't know right off the top of my head what the numbers are for being defined as middle income status.
Nor do I, to be honest.
Okay. I mean, in general, middle income status doesn't change your eligibility for rent stabilization, but I don't know whether in 80-20, which is a program we don't really use anymore, but there's still units existing, where there was in theory a cutoff on your being able to live there in the quote unquote 20% of the units that were rent regulated. You know, I think we actually have to refer you to somebody who does housing policy for this one. If you call my office tomorrow, we can probably find somebody to help you with that answer, but I don't know off the top of my head. I get the question and it's complicated, but I don't know how to answer. I don't think Kim does, and it's not fair to ask the tax expert because it's not really a tax question. Okay. Okay. Oh, if I want to sublet my apartment for 1 year and I'm already receiving SCRIE, could I lose SCRIE?
I don't think you would lose SCRIE just for the fact of subletting, but the rent that you receive from the subletter would be added to your income. So if that puts you over the income eligibility limits, then yes.
Fair enough. Thank you. When providing the previous and current leases, are the originals expected, or can you provide Xerox copies?
Definitely copies.
Then your
Right.
originals.
Yeah, I would never give up my originals almost to anyone. Is the tax you have to pay for Social Security income deducted from your income eligibility for SCRIE?
The Social Security taxes that you pay, for example, on your W-2s, yes, those are deducted.
They are deducted. Great. Okay. Okay, this is someone, I'm not going to go through all the details, but they say they've been asked by Department of Finance to submit the same records multiple times and that things keep getting lost. So how do I get them to acknowledge receipt of documents? I guess one suggestion is to send everything registered mail. Do you guys have some other way that you follow through with receipts when you get information?
I would say if you've sent everything multiple times, what might be happening is one of two things. Your documents are in the long queue waiting to be reviewed by a processor. And in the meantime, those notice letters will just go out automatically. So they could have been received by SCRIE, but until someone actually looks at them, those letters will still go out. That's one thing that could have happened. The other thing is that there might be a disconnect. So sometimes people get letters over and over and over saying, please send us your lease. And they think I've sent the lease, but there's some issue with the lease. Like there's a part that's not checked off about what the term is, or maybe part of the signature got cut off, so that the tenant isn't sending what SCRIE actually wants. So if you think that's the case, you can contact my office and we can try and look into your file. But no, that's really if it's been, months, right? And you still keep getting the same letters. yeah, in that case, contact my office and see, and we can try and see if we can track down what the issue is.
So my SCRIE amount is supposed to be $517. But my landlord charges $527. I did get a new stove quite a few years ago. Is it possible that they're calculating an additional monthly charge to pay for the stove? I can't remember what the rules are about that in rent regulated units.
So from SCRIE's perspective, sometimes a stove is charged to a tenant as an apartment improvement, an individual apartment improvement. But I think the landlord is supposed to give you notice of that. But assuming that everything was done correctly, yeah, that would be your responsibility. SCRIE wouldn't cover something like that.
Got it. And I have to say, $10 a month, that sounds like a number that would pop up on the cost of a stove over X number of years. We talked about, I think we talked about, let's see, I just want to. Okay, if a 2022 tax report is used for SCRIE renewal, do I use 2022 Social Security figures or 2023 figures?
Can you say that again, Senator? I'm sorry.
Sure. If your 2022 tax report is used for your SCRIE renewal, do you use the 2022 Social Security amount or the 2023 Social Security amount?
So if you're receiving Social Security, you also will get a 1099 at the end of the year, the end of year statement. You would use that amount. So the 2022 end of year statement.
Yeah, it should all be the same income year, at least for Department of Finance.
Yeah.
Okay. Does the standard deduction on a tax form, is it included or excluded from the total income for SCRIE since it is not taxable?
It is ignored by SCRIE. SCRIE doesn't recognize standard deduction.
Great. Okay, and then yes, I think we answered the question. You can apply at any time for SCRIE. And again, even if it's taking a little longer to get it done than we all hope, you're eligible back to the date you applied. Sometimes people call up our office and they want to go over SCRIE, and my staffer will work with them and I'll get off the phone and say to me, you know, they've been eligible for 5 years and they didn't apply. And no, it's not retroactive back to when we realized you were eligible. It's only retroactive to the date you apply. So please, after watching tonight, if you have any doubt about whether you might be eligible for SCRIE or you were rejected at some previous point in life, please go ahead and make that application anyway, because you might be eligible now, even if you weren't eligible then. Rules do change, amounts do change. You might never have thought you were eligible and still thinking, this sounds a little complicated. Get that application in, give it a try, because I don't ever want to hear that somebody's rent went up 4, 5, 6% over the time period when they were eligible, but they didn't know about the program or to apply. And so that rent can never be reversed on them. That cannot be lowered. So we need you to make the application and to make sure that you're getting the benefits that you need before you walk yourself into a situation where you owe so much back rent that you're in emergency. We want to avoid everybody ending up in emergency situations for their rent. And then the last question, which is really not a SCRIE question, but is, oh, actually, wait, there's more. You can't send me more, Wendy, because we're out of time. But I'll just leave it with, so somebody's question that some landlords are trying to get the Supreme Court to overturn our right to rent stabilization and rent control. And that is true. There are cases that have been moving through the courts. The question here is, what recourse do we have to that action? And I sincerely think that the answer would be a crisis beyond anything we can comprehend in New York City if the federal Supreme Court decided to overturn rent regulation and rent stabilization. The good news is they've tried many times before, and even conservative judges on the Supreme Court have said that rent stabilization and rent control are perfectly legal in New York. So I'm counting on, even in these difficult times with a scary set of judges on the federal bench, in my opinion, that I still don't believe that we're going to find ourselves in that situation. But if we do, I don't even know how to start to answer the question about what is our recourse and what do we do. With that, even though there were more questions and some were very technical and specific to individuals, and in fairness, those are the ones you really need to follow up either with the finance department if it's an appeal, or with Kim Lerner to learn more about eligibility for the benefit overall. So I want to thank both of our special guests tonight so much for their participation. We couldn't have done it without you, and we thank you for your work every day on these benefits, on these programs. Again, these are such important programs for people. If you have friends or neighbors who you think could be eligible and might not know about this, when you get those materials from me, do me a favor, share them with them also. Urge them to check this out for themselves, because it's amazing how many people are eligible on paper but have not applied for SCRIE or DRE. And so we need to do as much outreach as we can to make sure people are taking advantage of this program. So with that, I want to thank our guests. I want to thank my remarkable staff. And I want to remind you all that our next virtual town hall is the final session of a 3-part financial roadmap series, which is scheduled for next Tuesday, September 26th from 7 to 8 p.m. And that's going to be on the power of investing, stocks, bonds, and alternative assets. We already had parts 1 and 2 of that series. I want to thank everybody for attending. I hope to see you at another town hall, virtually or in person soon. And again, have a good night and stay safe and get your COVID vaccine, please. Thank you. Good night.